I had it all figured out. Every last detail mapped out in my mind like a military operation. The baby shower would be perfect. Not just good, but magazine-worthy perfect. I'd show everyone, especially my daughter Sarah, that her old mother still had what it took. At 55, I wasn't ready to be put out to pasture. Not yet. But lately, that's exactly how Sarah had been treating me. Like I was some doddering old woman who couldn't be trusted with anything more complex than watering plants. Well, this baby shower would change all that. I spent 3 weeks planning. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, Pinterest boards, and careful calculations. I measured twice, cut once, as my late husband used to say. The theme would be Woodland Wonderland. Soft greens and golds with touches of cream and rose gold. Elegant but not stuffy. Instagram-worthy but not trying too hard. The venue was my own backyard, transformed beyond recognition. I'd hired landscapers to create a fairy tale setting with string lights cascading from the old oak tree, vintage wooden signs pointing to different activity stations, and a backdrop of artificial ivy and paper flowers that looked so real you'd want to water them. The menu was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for one person, but I was determined. Cucumber sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, mini quiches that took me 6 attempts to get right, a 3-tier cake that I'd practiced making 4 times, and enough appetizers to feed a small army. Everything homemade, everything from scratch, everything perfect. "Mom, you're going overboard," Sarah had said when I showed her the preliminary plans. We were sitting in her pristine apartment, the one that Jake paid for, and she was absent-mindedly rubbing her 7-month belly while scrolling through her phone. "It's your first baby," I replied, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "My first grandchild. It deserves to be special." She looked up then, and for a moment, I saw something soften in her green eyes, the same eyes she'd inherited from me. "I know, Mom. I appreciate it, really. It's just, Jake thinks maybe we should hire a professional planner, someone who knows what they're doing." The words hit me like a slap. Someone who knows what they're doing. As if I hadn't planned countless events over the years. As if I hadn't organized her birthday parties when she was little, turning our modest home into whatever fantasy she'd dreamed up that year. Pirates, princesses, superheroes. I'd done them all, and she'd loved every minute of it. "I know what I'm doing," I said quietly. "Of course you do," she said, but her tone was the kind you'd use with a child who insists they can tie their own shoes, while you watch them struggle with the laces. "It's just that Jake's family is used to a certain standard. His mother had 3 wedding planners for his sister's baby shower. Jake's family. Everything came back to Jake's family these days. The Pemberton family with their old money and their casual arrogance, treating everyone else like amusing curiosities. I'd met them exactly twice. Once at Sarah and Jake's engagement party, where they'd looked at me like I was a stain on their expensive furniture, and once at the wedding, where they'd seated me at a table with the caterer's relatives. "This will meet any standard they have," I assured her. "Trust me." Sarah's phone buzzed, and her attention was immediately diverted. "Jake's texting. His mother wants to know if we need her to bring anything special. She has connections with some fancy bakery in the city. I'm making the cake myself," I said firmly. "Right, of course." She was typing on her phone again, not really listening. "I'll tell her we have it handled." But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. The assumption that her poor, simple mother couldn't possibly compete with the Pemberton family's connections and their casual wealth. I left her apartment that day more determined than ever. I would show them all, Sarah, Jake, his insufferable family, that Linda Morrison could throw a party that would put their fancy events to shame. The guest list had been a battleground in itself. Sarah wanted to keep it small and intimate, just close friends and immediate family. But Jake's mother had other ideas, and Jake's mother always got her way. The list grew from 20 people to 40, then to 60, and finally settled at 73 guests. "I don't even know half these people," Sarah complained during one of our planning sessions. "Jake's family has social obligations," I found myself saying, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. When had I started defending the Pembertons? When had I started talking like them? As if appearances mattered more than actual relationships. The truth was, I was terrified. Terrified that I'd bite off more than I could chew, that I'd embarrass Sarah in front of all these important people, that I'd prove once and for all that I wasn't good enough for my daughter's new life. But I was also angry at being dismissed, angry at being treated like some elderly aunt who meant well but couldn't be trusted with real responsibilities. I was 55, not 95. I had a college degree, a successful career before Sarah was born, and 30 years of life experience that these young people couldn't even imagine. The final week before the shower was a blur of activity. I barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination. I tested recipes, adjusted decorations, made lists, and checked them twice. My hands were raw from crafting. My back ached from hours of preparation, but I pushed through. 2 days before the shower, disaster struck. The caterer I'd hired for the drinks, the one expense I'd allowed myself, called to cancel. A burst pipe at their facility, they claimed, though I suspected they'd gotten a better offer elsewhere. I stood in my kitchen at 2 a.m, surrounded by half-finished decorations and mounting panic. 73 people were expecting drinks, and all I had was a refrigerator full of ingredients and my own 2 hands. "You can do this," I whispered to myself. The same words I'd said when David died 5 years ago, leaving me alone in our empty house with nothing but memories and a mortgage. "You've gotten through worse." I called in every favor I had. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, agreed to help with the flower arrangements. My sister drove down from Albany with her punch bowl and her grandmother's silver serving pieces. My friend Margaret from book club brought her teenage grandson to help with setup. By the morning of the shower, my backyard looked like something out of a fairy tale. The early spring sun filtered through the string lights, casting everything in a golden glow. The tables were perfectly set with mismatched vintage china that I'd collected from thrift stores and garage sales over the past month. The effect was charming and eclectic, not the sterile perfection of a professional event, but something with heart and personality. I stood in my kitchen, putting the finishing touches on the cake, when Sarah arrived for the final walkthrough. She stepped into the backyard and stopped dead in her tracks. "Mom," she breathed, and for a moment, I saw wonder in her eyes. This is beautiful." My heart soared. This was it. This was the moment I'd been working toward for weeks. The moment when my daughter would see that her mother was still capable of creating something magical. "You like it?" I asked, trying to keep the desperate need for approval out of my voice. "It's incredible," she said, walking slowly through the space, taking in every detail. The lights, the flowers, the table settings. It's like something out of a magazine. I felt tears prick my eyes. Finally, she saw what I was capable of. Then Jake arrived. He stepped into the backyard with that casual confidence that came from never having to doubt his place in the world. His eyes swept over my carefully crafted wonderland, and I watched his expression shift from mild interest to something I couldn't quite read. "Wow," he said, but there was something in his tone that made my stomach clench. "This is a lot." "Isn't it amazing?" Sarah said, slipping her arm through his. "Mom did all of this herself." "I can tell," Jake said, and somehow he made it sound like an insult. He walked over to one of my hand-painted signs, "Baby Love This Way," with a little arrow pointing toward the gift table, and I saw him smirk. Actually smirk at my handiwork. "Very homemade," he said to Sarah in a voice just loud enough for me to hear. The magic began to drain out of the moment, like air from a punctured balloon. Sarah looked at me with new eyes, seeing the space through Jake's sophisticated perspective. The mismatched china suddenly looked shabby instead of charming. The handcrafted signs looked amateur instead of personal. "Maybe we should have gone with a professional," Sarah murmured, echoing Jake's unspoken criticism. I felt something cold settle in my chest. After weeks of work, after pouring my heart and soul into creating something beautiful for my daughter, it was being dismissed because it didn't meet the Pemberton standard of effortless perfection. "The guests will be arriving soon," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I should finish getting ready. As I walked back to the house, I heard Jake say to Sarah, "Don't worry, babe. No one expects Martha Stewart. It's sweet that she tried. Sweet that she tried." As if I were a child playing dress-up instead of a grown woman who had spent weeks creating something meaningful for her daughter's special day. I stood in my bedroom, staring at myself in the mirror. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, a soft blue that brought out my eyes, elegant but not attention-grabbing. I'd even gone to the salon for the first time in months, getting my graying hair styled and highlighted. But looking at myself now, all I could see was what Jake saw, an aging woman trying too hard, playing at being something she wasn't, A mother who didn't understand that her time had passed, that she was supposed to step aside gracefully and let the next generation take over. The first guests began arriving at exactly 2 o'clock. I watched from my kitchen window as the Pembertons swept in like visiting royalty. Jake's mother, Patricia, wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my mortgage payment. She surveyed my decorations with the cool appraisal of someone used to finding things lacking. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and went out to greet my guests. This was my daughter's day, and I would not let my own hurt feelings ruin it. I had worked too hard and come too far to let the Pembertons' casual cruelty defeat me. But even as I smiled and welcomed everyone to my home, I could feel the judgment in their polite compliments. How charming, they said. So creative. Very unique. The kind of praise you give to a child's art project. Encouraging, but not quite sincere. The shower was scheduled to run from 2 to 5, and I had every minute planned out. Games at 2:30, lunch at 3, cake at 4, and gifts to close out the afternoon. It should have been perfect. And for a while, it almost was. The first hour went smoothly. The guests mingled, complimenting the decorations and sampling the appetizers I'd spent days preparing. My cucumber sandwiches disappeared quickly, and I saw several people go back for seconds of my mini quiches. Even Patricia Pemberton grudgingly admitted that the spinach and feta tartlets were quite good. I felt a small surge of vindication. Whatever they thought of my homemade decorations, they couldn't argue with the food. I'd always been a good cook. It was one of the things David had loved about me, back when we were young, and our entire future stretched out ahead of us like an uncharted map. Sarah held court in the center of the backyard, radiant in a flowing white dress that accentuated her pregnancy glow. She looked beautiful, happy, surrounded by friends and family celebrating her upcoming arrival. This was what I had envisioned when I started planning the shower. My daughter at the center of a perfect day, feeling loved and supported. The games began right on schedule. I'd chosen classics. Baby bingo, guessing the baby food flavors, measuring Sarah's belly with ribbon. Simple, fun activities that would get people laughing and interacting. The kind of games I'd played at my own baby shower 30 years ago, when the world seemed simpler and my future seemed certain. But as I watched the guests reluctantly participate, I could sense their polite boredom. These weren't the sophisticated activities they were used to at their carefully orchestrated events. Patricia Pemberton sat stiffly through the baby food guessing game, her expression suggesting she'd rather be having a root canal. "Mom, maybe we should skip the next game," Sarah suggested quietly, catching me as I prepared to distribute ribbons for the belly measuring activity. People seem a little restless. I looked around the group. She was right. The younger guests were checking their phones. The older ones were making polite but strained conversation. Only a few people seemed genuinely engaged, and they were mostly my friends, people who understood that sometimes the heart mattered more than the sophistication level. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's move on to lunch." The lunch service should have been my moment of triumph. I'd spent hours preparing everything myself, and the spread looked magnificent on my carefully arranged buffet table. Sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, salads artfully arranged in vintage serving bowls, and a selection of hot dishes that had required precise timing to have everything ready simultaneously. But as the guests filed past the buffet, I noticed the small hesitations, the polite portions, the way people seemed to be eating out of obligation rather than enjoyment. And then I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. 2 of Jake's cousins were standing near the dessert table, unaware that I was close enough to hear them through the decorative screen of ivy I'd hung there. "Poor Sarah," one of them was saying. "Her mother really went all out, didn't she?" "It's sweet," the other replied, in a community center potluck kind of way. Very earnest. They both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from shared superiority, from knowing you're part of an inner circle that looks down on everyone else's efforts. I heard Jake's mother offered to plan this whole thing, but Sarah's mom insisted on doing it herself, something about proving she could handle it. Well, she certainly proved something. More laughter. I stood frozen behind my ivy screen, feeling their casual cruelty wash over me like ice water. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd poured my heart into, reduced to a joke between 2 spoiled women who'd never had to prove their worth to anyone. I forced myself to step away, to keep moving, to keep playing the role of gracious hostess, but their words echoed in my head, mixing with every slight, every dismissive comment. every moment when I'd felt like an outsider in my own daughter's life. The cake cutting should have been the highlight of the afternoon. I'd spent hours perfecting the 3-tier creation, a delicate vanilla sponge with raspberry filling and cream cheese frosting. I'd watched YouTube videos to learn the professional decorating techniques, practiced piping roses until my hands cramped. The finished product was beautiful, not bakery perfect, but made with love and attention to detail. "Speech! Speech!" someone called out as Sarah stood beside the cake, radiant and glowing. Sarah laughed, one hand resting on her belly. "I just want to thank everyone for being here today. This baby is so lucky to have all of you in their life already." Her eyes found me across the crowd. "And especially thank you to my mom, who worked so hard to make today special. Even though I told her she didn't need to go to all this trouble. Even though I told her she didn't need to go to all this trouble." The words hit me like a physical blow. In front of 73 people, my daughter had just announced that my weeks of work, my sacrifice, my desperate attempt to create something beautiful for her, had been unnecessary trouble. "Mom really went above and beyond," Sarah continued, oblivious to the pain she was causing. "I keep telling her she needs to learn to delegate, to not take everything on herself. She's not getting any younger, and some things are better left to professionals." The crowd chuckled appreciatively, as if my daughter's gentle mockery of her aging mother was the height of wit. I stood there, holding the cake knife I'd intended to present to Sarah for the ceremonial first cut, and felt something inside me wither and die. "But that's just Mom," Sarah said with fond exasperation. Always convinced she can handle everything herself, even when it would be easier to just hire someone. She never learned to ask for help. Never learned to ask for help. As if my independence were a character flaw instead of a survival skill I'd developed after years of being let down by people who were supposed to support me. I had asked for help. I'd asked David to get that mold checked before it was too late. I'd asked my boss for flexible hours when Sarah was sick as a child. I'd asked my own mother to move closer after Sarah was born, so she could be part of her granddaughter's life. But asking for help and receiving it were two very different things, and I'd learned early that the only person I could truly rely on was myself. "Anyway," Sarah concluded, raising her glass of sparkling cider, "here's to family, even when they drive you crazy with their good intentions." Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. Everyone except me. I stood there with that cake knife in my hand, watching my daughter bask in the affectionate laughter of people who found my love amusing, my efforts charmingly misguided. Patricia Pemberton caught my eye across the crowd and gave me what I suppose she thought was a sympathetic smile, the kind of smile you give to someone whose inadequacy you pity but don't particularly want to address. "The cake looks lovely, Linda," she said in a voice loud enough for others to hear. "So, homie, you can always tell when something is made with a mother's love instead of professional precision. Made with a mother's love instead of professional precision." Another artfully delivered insult, disguised as a compliment. The implication was clear. Amateur work that fell short of real standards, but was acceptable because of the sentimental value. I handed the cake knife to Sarah with hands that barely trembled. "Would you like to do the honors?" As she cut into the cake I'd spent hours perfecting, I noticed Jake whisper something in her ear that made her giggle. Whatever private joke they were sharing, it felt like another small knife sliding between my ribs. The gift opening was a blur of pastel colors and exclamations of delight. Expensive strollers, designer baby clothes, elaborate nursery decorations that cost more than some people's cars. My own gift, a handmade baby blanket I'd spent months knitting, along with a silver cup engraved with the baby's expected birth date, looked shabby beside the mountain of high-end purchases. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said when she unwrapped my blanket. "You made this yourself." Her tone suggested surprise rather than delight, as if the idea of creating something by hand was quaint, but impractical in their world of designer everything. "I started it the day you told me you were pregnant," I said quietly. She held up the blanket for everyone to see. Months of work, every stitch made with love and anticipation for my grandchild. The cream and yellow colors I'd chosen seemed pale and simple next to the vibrant, expensive gifts surrounding it. "It's beautiful," Patricia Pemberton said with that same condescending kindness. "So sweet that you took the time. Though I hope you know you don't have to make everything yourself, Linda. There are wonderful artisans who specialize in baby items now. Wonderful artisans." As if I were some hobbyist playing at being crafty instead of a grandmother who wanted to create something meaningful for her grandchild. The afternoon dragged on. Conversations swirled around me. Talk of nannies and private schools, vacation homes and trust funds. Sarah had moved seamlessly into this world of casual wealth, speaking their language with fluency I'd never taught her. When had she learned to discuss international preschools and designer nursery themes as if they were normal concerns? As the guests began to leave, I busied myself with cleanup. Paper plates stacked neatly, leftover food wrapped and stored, decorations carefully taken down so they could be used again, though I couldn't imagine when or why I'd ever want to recreate this particular humiliation. "Mom, you don't have to clean everything up right now," Sarah said, lowering herself carefully into one of the folding chairs I'd rented. Her face was flushed with the exertion of pregnancy and the excitement of the day. "I don't mind," I replied, continuing to gather up the discarded wrapping paper and ribbon. "You should rest. I keep telling you. You need to learn to delegate. You could have hired someone to handle all of this. The setup, the food, the cleanup. You didn't need to exhaust yourself trying to do everything alone." I stopped what I was doing and looked at her. Really looked at her. When had my daughter become someone who thought hiring people was the solution to every problem? When had she started speaking about service workers as interchangeable conveniences, rather than real people with their own lives and struggles? "I wanted to do it myself," I said simply. "But why?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why make things harder than they need to be? Jake's mom has a whole list of people she uses for events like this. Caterers, decorators, cleanup crews, people who know what they're doing. People who know what they're doing." There it was again, that casual dismissal of my abilities, my effort, my love. "Because it's my grandchild too," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Because I wanted to create something personal and meaningful, not just throw money at a problem until it went away." Sarah's expression shifted. A flash of something, irritation, embarrassment? I couldn't tell. "You don't need to get defensive, Mom. I'm just saying there are easier ways to handle things. Smarter ways. Smarter ways." As if choosing to invest my own time and energy instead of money I didn't have was somehow foolish. "You know what?" I said, setting down the stack of plates I'd been carrying. "You're right. Next time, hire professionals. Hire someone who knows what they're doing. Hire someone who won't embarrass you with their amateur efforts." "Mom, I didn't say you embarrassed me. You didn't have to say it. It's been written all over your face since Jake walked into this backyard and decided my homemade decorations weren't up to Pemberton standards." Sarah's face flushed. "That's not fair. Jake never said anything about—" "He didn't have to. I saw his face. I heard him talking to you. And I've been watching you see this party through his eyes all afternoon, watching you realize that your mother's best efforts are just a cute amateur hour compared to what his family considers appropriate." "You're being ridiculous," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Tell me honestly, Sarah. Are you proud of what I did here today? Or are you embarrassed that your friends had to endure your mother's pathetic attempt to compete with people who have more money than sense?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on her swollen belly. When she finally looked up at me, there was something in her eyes that broke my heart all over again. "I just want things to be easier for you, Mom. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. But I did have to prove something. I had to prove that I still mattered, that I still had something to contribute to my daughter's life, that being older and less wealthy didn't make me worthless. I had to prove that I deserved a place in my grandchild's world, not just as a tolerated relic, but as someone whose love had value." "You're right," I said finally. "I don't have to prove anything, and I won't try to anymore." I finished cleaning up in silence while Sarah sat in her chair, occasionally offering to help and being politely declined. The backyard slowly returned to its normal state, just a middle-aged woman's modest outdoor space, no longer transformed by fairy lights and homemade magic. As Sarah prepared to leave, arms full of gifts and leftover cake, she paused at the back door. "Mom, I hope you know how much I appreciate everything you did today. It really was beautiful. Thank you," I said, not trusting myself to say more. "And I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. I didn't mean to sound ungrateful. It's just pregnancy hormones, you know? I haven't been thinking clearly about a lot of things lately." I nodded, accepting the excuse she offered even though we both knew it wasn't the whole truth. The pregnancy hormones hadn't made her choose Jake's perspective over mine. They hadn't made her dismiss my efforts as unnecessary trouble. They hadn't created the distance that had been growing between us for months. After she left, I sat in my empty kitchen surrounded by the remnants of the day, leftover food that would take me weeks to eat, decorations that would go back into storage, probably never to be used again, the cake I'd worked so hard on, now missing its ceremonial slice, sitting on my counter like a monument to good intentions gone wrong. I had wanted so desperately to matter, to prove that I still had something valuable to offer. Instead, I had proven exactly the opposite. I had shown everyone, including myself, that my best efforts were no match for casual wealth and professional expertise. That night, I called my sister Margaret. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice warm with anticipation. "It was fine," I said, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "Just fine? Come on, Linda. I saw how hard you worked on that party. It had to be more than fine." I stared out my kitchen window at the backyard, where this morning there had been magic, and this afternoon there had been judgment. The string lights were still up, dark now, looking forlorn against the evening sky. "It was exactly what they expected," I said finally. "A nice try from the amateur." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She knew me well enough to hear what I wasn't saying. "Their loss," she said simply. "Anyone who can't appreciate what you did for that girl doesn't deserve to have you in their lives." But that was the problem, wasn't it? They were in my life whether they deserved it or not. Sarah was my daughter, Jake was her husband, and the baby would be my grandchild. I couldn't simply walk away from people who disappointed me, no matter how much they hurt me. I spent the week after the shower in a kind of emotional suspended animation. I went through the motions of my normal routine: work, grocery shopping, the small maintenance tasks that keep a life running, but everything felt muted, gray, like I was seeing the world through thick glass. Sarah called twice to thank me again and to rave about how much everyone had enjoyed the party. She either genuinely didn't understand how her comments had affected me, or she was trying to repair the damage with retrospective enthusiasm. Either way, I played my part, accepting her thanks graciously and deflecting any deeper conversation about what had happened. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought I could absorb this latest disappointment the way I'd absorbed so many others over the years, with resignation and the grim determination to keep moving forward. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. Sarah's name flashed on my phone screen, and I almost didn't answer. Our conversation since the baby shower had been strained, both of us too polite, too careful, dancing around the hurt feelings that neither of us wanted to address directly. "Mom?" Her voice was different, shaky, young in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, calling me from a party where things had gotten out of hand. "What's wrong, honey?" "Jake's gone." 3 words that changed everything. I sat down heavily on my bed, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what she was telling me. "What do you mean gone?" "He left, yesterday morning. He packed a bag and left. He said he wasn't ready for this, for the baby, for marriage, for any of it. He said he made a mistake." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, punctuated by tears and the kind of breathing that comes from crying so hard you can barely get air into your lungs. "Where are you now?" I asked, already reaching for my car keys. "I'm at the apartment. But Mom, I can't stay here. Everything is in his name. The lease, the utilities, everything. His lawyer called this morning. I have 30 days to move out." My mind raced, calculating logistics and timelines. Sarah was 8 months pregnant. She had no job. Jake had insisted she didn't need to work, and apparently no legal claim to the life they'd built together. "What about the joint accounts? Your savings?" "There aren't any joint accounts. He said it was easier to keep finances separate until after the baby was born, that we'd sort everything out then." "Mom, I don't have anything. No money, no job, no place to live. I don't know what to do." The same daughter who'd dismissed my efforts as unnecessary trouble was now calling me in desperation because she'd trusted someone else to handle the important things and been betrayed. The irony wasn't lost on me, but this wasn't the time for "I told you so's." "I'm coming over," I said. "Don't make any decisions until I get there." I called in sick to work and drove to Sarah's apartment, Jake's apartment, in record time. I found her sitting on the couch in her pajamas, surrounded by tissues and the remnants of what looked like several days of not taking care of herself. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw my little girl again. Not the sophisticated young woman who'd been embarrassed by her mother's homemade baby shower, but the child who'd come running to me with scraped knees and broken hearts, trusting that I could fix anything. "Oh, Mom," she said, and the dam broke completely. I held her while she cried, this pregnant woman who suddenly seemed so much younger than her 28 years. "Tell me everything," I said, when the initial storm passed. The story that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Jake had been planning his exit for weeks, quietly moving money, canceling credit cards, making arrangements that left Sarah with nothing. The engagement ring had been a family heirloom that legally belonged to his family. The car was in his name. Even her clothes seemed somehow tainted by his money, purchased with credit cards he'd controlled. "I should have seen it coming," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and disbelief. He'd been distant for weeks. Ever since the baby shower, actually. He kept talking about how different our families were, how maybe we'd rushed into things. Ever since the baby shower, I felt a cold recognition settle in my chest. Had my amateur efforts somehow convinced Jake that Sarah came from unsuitable stock? Had my homemade decorations and do-it-yourself approach highlighted exactly the kind of class differences that the Pemberton family found distasteful? "This isn't your fault," I said firmly, as much to myself as to her. "Isn't it? Maybe if I'd been smarter about the finances, if I'd insisted on joint accounts, if I'd kept my job instead of playing housewife." Sarah, listen to me. A man who abandons his pregnant wife was never going to be a good husband, no matter how smart you were about money. This is about his character, not your choices. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What am I going to do, Mom? I'm having a baby in 4 weeks. I have no money, no job, nowhere to live. I can't even afford diapers." For the first time since the phone call, I felt a small flutter of something that might have been satisfaction. Not at my daughter's pain, never that, but at finally being needed. At finally being the person she turned to when the professional planners and expensive solutions couldn't help. "You're going to come home with me," I said. "Mom, I can't. Your house is so small, and with the baby, we'll make it work. It's temporary until you get back on your feet. I don't want to be a burden." I looked at this young woman who'd spent months treating me like I was the burden, who'd made it clear that my best efforts weren't good enough for her new life. Now she was worried about being a burden to me. "You're not a burden," I said. "You're my daughter, and that baby is my grandchild. We're family, and family takes care of each other." The next few hours were a blur of practicalities. I helped Sarah pack her personal belongings, surprisingly few things that were actually hers, rather than joint purchases Jake's money had paid for. We called lawyers and discovered that without marriage assets or employment history, Sarah's options were limited. We researched assistance programs for pregnant women and single mothers. It was humbling and terrifying, and utterly different from the life Sarah had been planning. Instead of a nursery and a luxury apartment, she was looking at sharing my small spare room. Instead of a husband to support her during those first difficult months with a newborn, she'd have her middle-aged mother who still had to work full-time to pay her own bills. "I'm scared, Mom," she admitted, as we loaded her belongings into my car. "I know, honey, but we'll figure it out. I keep thinking about what people are going to say. Jake's family, our friends, everyone who was at the baby shower. They're going to know that my husband left me, and I had to move back in with my mother. The same people who'd found my homemade efforts charmingly amateur would now be clucking their tongues over my daughter's spectacular fall from grace. The irony was almost too perfect. "Let them talk," I said. "People who judge you for doing what you have to do to survive aren't worth worrying about." That first week of Sarah living with me was an adjustment for both of us. My small house suddenly felt even smaller, with 2 adults navigating around each other's routines and emotions. Sarah was dealing with the hormonal chaos of late pregnancy, combined with the trauma of abandonment, which meant mood swings that could shift from despair to fury in the span of minutes. I found myself walking on eggshells, trying to be supportive without being overbearing, helpful without being patronizing. It was a delicate balance, especially given how our relationship had been strained since the baby shower. "I can't believe I was so stupid," Sarah said one evening, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. All the signs were there. The way he kept putting off setting up joint accounts, how he never wanted to talk about long-term plans beyond the baby's birth, even the way he acted at the shower, like he was embarrassed to be associated with our family. Our family. It was the first time since her engagement that Sarah had used that phrase to include me without qualification. "You weren't stupid," I said, sitting down across from her. "You were trusting. There's a difference." "Is there? Because right now they feel like the same thing." I watched my daughter struggle with a disillusionment that reminded me painfully of my own younger self. When David died, I'd had to confront the reality that the future I'd planned wasn't guaranteed, that security was largely an illusion, and that the only person I could truly count on was myself. "You'll get through this," I said. "We'll get through this." She looked at me then with something I hadn't seen in her eyes for months, genuine gratitude instead of polite obligation. "I'm sorry, Mom." "For what?" "For how I acted at the baby shower. For the things I said. For treating you like you were some kind of embarrassing relative instead of my mother who was trying to do something nice for me." The apology I'd been waiting for without realizing it. But now that it came, I found I didn't need it as much as I'd thought I would. "You were trying to fit into a world that made you feel like you had to choose between them and me," I said. "I understand that. It wasn't a choice I should have made. Maybe not. But it's a choice you can unmake." Over the following days, I watched Sarah slowly come back to herself. Without Jake's constant subtle criticism and his family's suffocating standards, she began to relax into the person she'd been before she'd tried to transform herself into a Pemberton wife. She helped me with dinner preparations, not because I needed the help, but because she seemed to find comfort in the simple domesticity. We talked while we chopped vegetables and stirred sauces. Really talked, in a way we hadn't for months. "I used to love cooking," she said one evening as we prepared a simple pasta dish together. "Remember how I always wanted to help you in the kitchen when I was little? You wanted to crack the eggs," I said, smiling at the memory. "You insisted you were old enough, even though you always got shell pieces in the bowl. Jake thought cooking was a waste of time. He said that's what restaurants were for, or catering services. I stopped cooking entirely after we got engaged." Another small piece of herself she'd given up in the name of fitting in. How many others had there been? How much of my daughter had been buried under the pressure to become someone else's idea of perfect? The baby shower gifts from the Pembertons and their circle remained unopened in my spare room, too painful for Sarah to look at. They represented the life she'd lost, the future that had been snatched away. But slowly, we began preparing for the reality of what was coming, instead of mourning what wouldn't be. I drove her to prenatal appointments and watched her face when the doctor assured us that despite the stress, the baby was healthy and developing normally. We bought practical necessities from discount stores instead of designer boutiques, onesies that came in packs of 5 instead of individual outfits that cost $50 each. "This feels more real somehow," Sarah said, as we assembled a simple crib in what had been my home office. "When Jake and I were buying things for the nursery, it felt like we were playing house, like it was all theoretical. Maybe because you were doing it for other people's approval instead of for yourselves," I suggested. She was quiet for a moment, considering this. "You're probably right. Everything with Jake felt performative, like we were constantly auditioning for the role of perfect couple." As Sarah's due date approached, I found myself cautiously optimistic about our future. We'd developed a routine that worked for both of us. Sarah had started looking for work she could do from home once the baby was old enough for childcare. We'd figured out how to divide expenses and responsibilities in a way that didn't make either of us feel like a burden. Most importantly, Sarah seemed genuinely happy for the first time in months. Not the brittle, anxious happiness she'd displayed during her engagement, but a deeper contentment that came from knowing she was in control of her own life again. I should have known it was too good to last. The first sign of trouble came when Sarah started getting text messages from unknown numbers. At first, she thought they were spam, but the content was too specific, too personal. "Look at this," she said, showing me her phone one morning. "Someone's sending me links to gossip blogs." The links led to society pages and wedding websites that had covered Sarah and Jake's engagement. The photos from their engagement party, Sarah in a designer dress, Jake looking handsome and confident, both of them surrounded by the Pemberton family's wealthy friends, now had captions that made my stomach clench. "Local socialite Jake Pemberton calls off engagement to middle-class fiancé." Pemberton family sources cite fundamental incompatibilities in relationship breakdown. Society wedding canceled as groom reconsiders match. The stories were vicious in their polite language, painting Sarah as a gold digger who'd been found out, a social climber who'd overreached and been appropriately put back in her place. They referenced the baby shower, describing it as a charmingly amateur affair that highlighted the cultural differences between the families. My carefully planned, lovingly crafted baby shower, reduced to evidence of why my daughter wasn't good enough for their circle. "Who's sending these to you?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. I don't know, but they have my number, and they seem to know details about my relationship with Jake that weren't public knowledge. Someone from Jake's circle was systematically humiliating my daughter, making sure she understood her place in their social hierarchy. It wasn't enough that Jake had abandoned her. They wanted to ensure that everyone knew she'd been rejected, and why. Sarah tried to ignore the messages, but they kept coming. Photos from the baby shower with cruel commentary. Screenshots of social media posts from Jake's friends talking about his lucky escape. Anonymous tips to gossip columns about Sarah's current living situation. Pregnant ex-fiancé moves back in with mother after failed attempt to marry above her station. Why won't they just leave me alone? Sarah asked one evening, her voice breaking with exhaustion and frustration. I'm not part of their world anymore. I never really was. Why do they need to keep hurting me? Because cruelty was their entertainment? I thought, but didn't say. Because people with too much money and too little empathy needed someone to look down on to make themselves feel superior. Because my daughter had committed the unforgivable sin of making one of their own look foolish by trusting him. Because they're scared, I said instead. Scared of what? I'm 8 months pregnant and living with my mother. What could I possibly do to them? You could tell the truth. About Jake. About how he handled things. About what kind of people they really are underneath all that polish. Sarah looked at me with surprise. I would never. I know you wouldn't. But they don't know that. So they're trying to destroy your credibility before you can damage theirs. The harassment escalated over the next few days. Someone created fake social media accounts in Sarah's name, posting desperate messages about trying to win Jake back. Photos of our modest home appeared on local gossip sites with snide comments about how the mighty have fallen. I watched my daughter withdraw into herself again, the confidence she'd been rebuilding crumbling under the sustained attack. She stopped wanting to leave the house, afraid of running into people who might have seen the stories. She stopped answering her phone unless it was me or her doctor. Maybe I should just disappear, she said one night, staring out my living room window. Move somewhere far away where nobody knows this story. You're not running away, I said firmly. These people don't get to drive you out of your own life. What choice do I have? This is only going to get worse when the baby is born. They're never going to leave me alone. I looked at my daughter, my strong, intelligent, capable daughter who'd been broken down by people who saw her pain as entertainment, and felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. Maybe it's time they learned what happens when they mess with the wrong family, I said. Sarah looked at me in surprise. What do you mean? I was thinking about Jake's abandonment, about the Pemberton family's casual cruelty, about months of being treated like I was too old and too poor and too unsophisticated to matter. I was thinking about my daughter's pain, and my grandchild's future, and the debt that these people owed for the damage they'd caused. But mostly, I was thinking about the side of myself that Sarah had never seen, the side that had fought tooth and nail to survive after David died, that had clawed my way up from nothing when my own family wrote me off, that had learned the hard way that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. I mean, it's time I reminded some people that underestimating me was their first mistake, I said. The next morning, I called in a personal day and spent it doing research. Not the kind of research I'd done for the baby shower, Pinterest boards and recipe tutorials, but the kind I'd learned to do in my 20s when I was trying to build a career in a field that didn't welcome women with my background. I started with Jake Pemberton. It's amazing what you can learn about someone when you know where to look and have the patience to dig. Social media profiles, professional networking sites, property records, court filings, business registrations. The internet has made it remarkably easy to piece together someone's life story if you're methodical about it. Jake, I discovered, was not quite the golden boy his family presented him as. He'd had 3 previous engagements that had ended mysteriously, all to women from backgrounds similar to Sarah's. There was a pattern there. He seemed to have a type, and that type was women who could be easily discarded when he grew bored, or his family decided they weren't suitable. There were also financial irregularities. Jake's consulting business, which he'd always been vague about when Sarah asked, appeared to exist primarily on paper. The real money came from a trust fund that his grandfather had established, but there were conditions attached to that inheritance that Jake had never mentioned to Sarah. Specifically, the trust required him to be married to someone of good moral character by his 30th birthday, which was coming up in 6 months. The payments would stop if he wasn't married by then, and they would be permanently revoked if he divorced within the first 5 years of marriage. Jake hadn't abandoned Sarah because he'd suddenly realized he wasn't ready for commitment. He'd abandoned her because his family had decided she wasn't suitable for their purposes, and he'd chosen money over love. But there was more. The harassment campaign against Sarah wasn't just casual cruelty. It was strategic. Jake needed her to look like the villain in their breakup, so that when he inevitably found a more acceptable wife in the next few months, it would seem like he was the wronged party who'd escaped a manipulative gold digger. I printed out everything I'd found and organized it into neat folders, the way I'd learned to do in my corporate days when I was preparing presentations for executives who expected perfection. Facts, documentation, timelines, connections, a complete picture of who Jake Pemberton really was beneath the charm and family money. Then I started researching the Pemberton family itself. Old money families like theirs accumulated secrets the way ordinary people accumulated dust. Hidden scandals, financial improprieties, social embarrassments that had been covered up or forgotten over the generations. And the current generation was no exception. Patricia Pemberton, Jake's mother, sat on the boards of several charitable organizations that had questionable financial practices. Money that was supposed to go to helping disadvantaged children had somehow found its way into lavish, administrative expenses that coincidentally corresponded to the Pembertons' vacation schedule. Jake's father had a business partnership with a man who'd been quietly blacklisted from several industries for fraud, though that connection had been carefully hidden behind layers of shell companies and intermediary arrangements. Jake's sister, the one who'd had 3 wedding planners for her baby shower, was married to a man who'd been accused of sexual harassment by 4 different women, though the cases had all been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. The Pemberton family's money might be old, but it certainly wasn't clean. By the end of the day, I had enough material to destroy their carefully cultivated reputation several times over. The question was how to use it. I could go to the media, but that would make Sarah a public figure in a scandal she wanted nothing to do with. I could confront them directly, but that would give them time to prepare defenses and counterattacks. I could use the information to make them back off quietly, but that wouldn't address the damage they'd already done to my daughter's reputation. I needed something more elegant, something that would stop their harassment campaign while giving Sarah the power to control her own narrative. Something that would make it clear that the Morrisons weren't quite as helpless as they'd assumed. The plan came to me while I was making dinner. Sarah sitting at the kitchen table sorting through resumes she'd printed from job websites. She was trying to rebuild her life from scratch, starting over at 28 with a baby coming and no resources except her own determination and whatever help I could provide. "What kind of work are you most interested in?" I asked, stirring the pasta sauce I'd made from ingredients we'd bought with coupons. "Honestly, I'd love to do event planning," she said. "I used to be good at organizing things, coordinating details, making sure everything ran smoothly, but I don't have any professional experience. And after the baby shower and everything that happened with Jake, I'm not sure anyone would trust me with their events." Event planning. Sarah had always been good at organizing things, even as a child. She'd planned elaborate birthday parties for her stuffed animals, coordinated neighborhood games that kept a dozen kids entertained for hours, managed school fundraisers that had impressed even the most demanding parents. "You're good at it because you understand that events are about people, not just logistics," I said. "The baby shower wasn't a failure because of your planning skills. It was beautiful because of them. It was your planning, Mom, not mine." "Was it? Who chose the theme? Who decided on the guest list? Who coordinated with everyone's schedules? Who made sure I knew what food people liked and didn't like?" Sarah looked up from her resumes, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I guess I did do a lot of the coordination." "You did all of the coordination. I just executed your vision." It was true, I realized as I said it. Sarah had been the real planner behind the baby shower. I'd just been so focused on proving myself that I'd taken credit for work that had actually been collaborative. "Maybe I could start small," she said thoughtfully. "Kids' parties, small celebrations, build up a portfolio." "Maybe you could," I agreed. "And maybe, in the process, we could rebuild her confidence while setting the stage for a much larger plan." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat at my computer and began drafting emails, not to the Pembertons directly, but to their friends, their business associates, their fellow board members. Carefully worded messages that mentioned my concern for Sarah's reputation and my hope that certain misunderstandings could be cleared up quietly. I didn't threaten anyone directly. I didn't mention the information I'd gathered. I simply introduced myself as Sarah Morrison's mother and suggested that perhaps we could all work together to ensure that any lingering bad feelings from Jake and Sarah's broken engagement didn't escalate into something that might be embarrassing for everyone involved. The responses began arriving within hours. Polite but nervous emails asking what exactly I was referring to. Phone calls from people who wanted to know what I knew and what I wanted. Messages that made it clear that the Pemberton family's friends and associates were suddenly very interested in making sure I felt heard and respected. I didn't respond to any of them immediately. Let them wonder. Let them worry about what I might do next. Instead, I focused on Sarah and the baby, who would be arriving soon. I helped her set up a simple website for her event planning business, using skills I'd learned during my corporate days, but had never thought to apply to creative endeavors. I reached out to my own network, friends from work, neighbors, book club members, to see if anyone might need help with upcoming celebrations. "Mrs. Morrison, this looks so professional," Sarah said when I showed her the finished website. "When did you learn to do graphic design?" I didn't. I just paid attention to what worked on other sites and tried to replicate it. Sometimes experience matters more than formal training. She looked at me with something approaching awe. "I keep forgetting how much you actually know about business stuff. I guess I always thought of you as just my mom. Just her mom. As if being her mother was the least important thing about me instead of the most important thing I'd ever done. Moms tend to have whole lives and skill sets beyond mothering," I said gently. "Sometimes our children don't see that until they're adults themselves." Over the next few days, I continued my quiet campaign of strategic networking. I didn't make any direct threats or demands. I simply made it clear that I was paying attention, that I had resources and connections they might not have expected, and that protecting my daughter's reputation was now my full-time priority. The harassment stopped almost immediately. No more anonymous text messages. No more cruel gossip blog posts. No more fake social media accounts. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly Sarah was no longer interesting enough to torment. "It's weird," Sarah said one morning, checking her phone and finding nothing but legitimate messages. "Do you think they just got bored?" "Maybe," I said, though we both knew that wasn't the whole explanation. The real test came when Sarah ran into some of Jake's friends at the grocery store. Instead of the smirks and whispered comments she'd been dreading, they were almost apologetic in their politeness. One of them even complimented her on how well she was handling everything, and suggested that Jake had been foolish to let her go. "What did you do?" Sarah asked me that evening. "I reminded some people that actions have consequences," I said, "and that sometimes those consequences come from unexpected directions." "Mom, you didn't do anything illegal, did you?" "I didn't have to. The truth about people like the Pembertons is usually damaging enough without any embellishment." She studied my face, looking for clues about what exactly I'd done. "I feel like I'm seeing a whole different side of you lately. You're seeing the side I've always had. The side I learned to hide because people are more comfortable when women my age seem harmless and ineffective." "You're not harmless," she said, with something that might have been admiration. "No," I agreed. "I'm not." Sarah went into labor on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before her due date but still within the range of normal. I drove her to the hospital with hands that shook only slightly, thinking about how different this was from what she'd planned with Jake. Instead of a husband holding her hand through contractions, she had her mother. Instead of a luxury birthing suite with amenities that cost more than most people's monthly salary, she had a standard room covered by Medicaid. Instead of a celebration with both extended families, she had me and my sister Margaret, who'd driven down from Albany the moment I called. But as I watched my daughter breathe through her labor pains with a strength I'd never seen in her before, I realized something had fundamentally changed about how she approached challenges. The young woman who'd been so worried about meeting other people's expectations had been replaced by someone focused on what actually mattered. "I'm scared, Mom," she said during a particularly difficult contraction. "I know, honey, but you're stronger than you think you are. What if I'm not good at this? What if I can't take care of a baby on my own? You're not on your own, and you're going to be an amazing mother, because you know what it feels like to be disappointed by people. You'll make sure your child never feels that way." Emily Rose Morrison was born at 3:47 p.m., weighing 6 pounds and 2 ounces, with a head full of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire maternity ward. Sarah cried when they placed her daughter on her chest. Not the gentle, elegant tears of movie births, but the raw, overwhelming sobs of someone who'd been through hell and finally found something worth fighting for. "She's perfect," Sarah whispered, staring down at the tiny face that was already making demanding expressions. "Look at her, Mom. She's absolutely perfect." I looked at my granddaughter, my fierce, beautiful, determined granddaughter who'd chosen to arrive early because she was ready to take on the world, and felt something settle into place in my chest. This was what mattered. Not expensive baby showers or social approval or meeting other people's standards. This tiny person who would grow up knowing that her mother and grandmother were women who didn't back down from fights. The next few weeks passed in a blur of feeding schedules and diaper changes, and the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for a newborn. Sarah rose to the challenge in ways that surprised even me, showing an intuitive understanding of her daughter's needs that made all the parenting books seem unnecessary. "I thought this would be harder," she said one evening as she rocked Emily to sleep. "I mean, it is hard, but it's not scary hard. It's just work. You're good at work," I pointed out. "You always have been." During Emily's nap times, Sarah continued building her event planning business. She'd booked 3 small parties for the following month: a 6-year-old's birthday party, a retirement celebration, and a baby shower for one of my coworkers who'd been impressed by the photos from Sarah's own shower. "It's ironic," Sarah said, as she worked on Pinterest boards for the upcoming events. "The party that made me feel like such a failure is now being used as evidence that I know what I'm doing. Maybe because you're looking at it differently now," I suggested. "Instead of seeing it as a test you failed, you're seeing it as work you did well." She paused in her planning and looked at me thoughtfully. "When did you get so wise about perspective?" "When I stopped caring what other people thought about my choices and started focusing on whether those choices were working for me and the people I love." It was true. Somewhere in the past few months, I'd stopped measuring my worth by other people's standards and started trusting my own judgment. Maybe it had happened when I'd realized that the Pembertons' approval wasn't worth having. Maybe it had been when I'd seen how quickly their cruelty could be stopped once they understood they weren't dealing with someone helpless. Or maybe it had been when I'd held my granddaughter for the first time and realized that this tiny person would grow up watching how her mother and grandmother handled challenges. I wanted Emily to learn that women in our family didn't apologize for taking up space or asking for what we needed. The vindication came, as these things often do, from an unexpected direction. 3 months after Emily was born, Sarah got a call from someone she didn't recognize, a woman named Claire who'd been a guest at the baby shower. "I hope you don't mind me calling," Claire said, "but I got your number from your mother's friend Margaret. I'm getting married next spring, and I was wondering if you might be available to help plan my wedding." Sarah explained that she was just starting her event planning business and had only done small parties so far, nothing as elaborate as a wedding. "That's exactly why I want to work with you," Claire said. "I was at your baby shower, and it was the most beautiful personal celebration I've ever attended. Everything felt authentic and meaningful instead of just expensive. I want my wedding to feel like that." More calls followed. Word spread through networks that had nothing to do with the Pemberton family's social circle. Working professionals who wanted elegant celebrations that didn't cost a fortune. Young couples who valued creativity over conspicuous consumption. Families who understood that the best parties were about bringing people together rather than impressing them. Sarah's business grew steadily, and with it, her confidence. She developed a reputation for creating beautiful events on reasonable budgets, for listening to what clients actually wanted instead of what they thought they should want, for making people feel celebrated rather than stressed. "I love this work," she told me one evening as she updated her client files. "I love taking someone's vision and figuring out how to make it real. I love the problem solving and the creativity, and the way people's faces light up when everything comes together." Emily, now sitting up and showing signs of her mother's determination, babbled her approval from her high chair. "You're good at it because you understand what events are really about," I said. "They're about marking moments that matter to people. The rest is just decoration." The real test of how much things had changed came when Patricia Pemberton called. I answered the phone on a Saturday morning while Sarah was at a client meeting and Emily was napping. I didn't recognize the number, but the voice was unmistakable. That crisp, condescending tone that had dismissed my homemade efforts as charmingly amateur. "Linda, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from, well, it doesn't matter how. I was wondering if we might have lunch sometime soon. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you." I almost laughed. Patricia Pemberton wanted to have lunch with me. The same woman who'd looked at my baby shower decorations like they were evidence of infectious poor taste now wanted to sit down for a civilized conversation. "What kind of things?" I asked. "Well, there's been some misunderstanding about how things ended between Jake and Sarah. Some unfortunate gossip that I think we could clear up if we put our heads together." Unfortunate gossip. As if the harassment campaign against my daughter had been an accident rather than a deliberate strategy. "I see. And why would you want to clear up this gossip now?" There was a pause. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I think we may have misjudged your family's character." What she meant was that they'd realized I wasn't as powerless as they'd assumed, and they wanted to make sure I didn't cause them any more trouble than I already had. "That's very thoughtful of you, Patricia, but I don't think lunch is necessary. The gossip seems to have died down on its own, don't you think?" "Yes, it has. I just want to make sure it stays that way." "I'm sure it will, as long as Sarah and Emily are left alone to live their lives in peace." Another pause. "Of course. We all want what's best for the baby. I'm glad we understand each other." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and marveled at how much had changed. 6 months ago, I would have been thrilled to receive a phone call from Patricia Pemberton. I would have seen it as validation, as proof that I was finally being taken seriously by people who mattered. Now I understood that Patricia Pemberton didn't matter. Her opinion of me didn't matter. Her family's social standing didn't matter. What mattered was the life Sarah and I were building together, the business she was growing through her own talent and hard work, and the granddaughter who would grow up knowing that her family's love didn't come with conditions or requirements to be someone other than herself. Sarah came home from her client meeting glowing with excitement. "Mom, you're not going to believe this, but I just booked the biggest event of my career, a corporate anniversary party for 200 people. They want me to handle everything: venue, catering, entertainment, decorations. It's more than I've ever taken on, but I think I can do it." "I know you can do it," I said. "And if you need help, I'm here. Actually, I was hoping you'd partner with me on this one." They specifically mentioned that they liked the idea of a mother-daughter team. Apparently, my client heard about us from someone who was at the baby shower and was impressed by how we worked together. Partner with me. Not hire me as an assistant or tolerate my help because she had no other choice, but actually partner with me as an equal. "I'd be honored," I said. That evening, after Emily was asleep and Sarah was working on preliminary plans for the corporate event, I stood in my backyard where the baby shower had taken place 6 months earlier. The string lights were still up, though I'd replaced the bulbs that had burned out over the winter. The garden was different now, more vegetables than flowers, more practical than decorative, but still beautiful in its own way. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, so desperate to prove her worth that she'd nearly broken herself trying to create perfection. That woman had measured her value by other people's reactions, had seen their approval as the only thing that mattered. I thought about my daughter, who'd learned the hard way that building your life around someone else's expectations was a recipe for disappointment, who discovered that the approval of people who didn't really know or care about you wasn't worth having. And I thought about Emily, sleeping peacefully in her crib, who would grow up in a family that valued authenticity over appearances, substance over status, love over social climbing. The baby shower had been a humiliation, but it had also been a beginning, the beginning of my daughter's journey back to herself, the beginning of our real relationship as adults, and the beginning of my understanding that the only approval I needed was my own. 6 months later, Sarah's event planning business was thriving. Emily was walking and getting into everything with the determination of someone who knew she was loved unconditionally, and I had learned that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. The Pembertons never bothered us again. Jake, I heard through the gossip networks that I now monitored more carefully, had married a senator's daughter in a lavish ceremony that was covered in all the society pages. The marriage looked perfect from the outside, which was probably all that mattered to people like them. I felt sorry for his new wife, though I doubted she'd welcome my sympathy. She'd learned soon enough what it meant to try to build a life with someone who saw relationships as transactions and love as a luxury he couldn't afford. But that was her story to live, not mine to worry about. My story, our story, was about something better. It was about discovering that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, but building a life so fulfilling that their opinion becomes irrelevant. It was about learning that family isn't just about blood, but about who shows up when things get hard, and who celebrates your victories without trying to diminish them. And it was about understanding that the love between a mother and daughter, tested by disappointment and strengthened by adversity, is powerful enough to overcome any obstacle that small-minded people might put in their way. Sometimes the greatest triumph isn't getting what you thought you wanted, but discovering that what you have is exactly what you needed all along.